Alex, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing very well. It's a big day in history that we get to speak, and there's going to be some very interesting years up ahead. And you know, the topics of today's conversation will be playing out in the real world.
Yeah, it is a momentous day. I watched both Trump's speech and I also watched Biden's inauguration. Really stood out as an event, like no other inauguration in some ways. And I know the Obama one was a huge one, but this one, I don't know, it just, I don't know, felt like a wave of relief
Well,
swept
I
across
think a lot
the
of people were
world.
also really upset that Trump did not pardon Snowden or Assange or
Joe
Reality
Exotic.
Winner or some of the other folks that civil liberties people wanted him to help out. And I think that was probably a wake up call in some respects.
I have a question for you. Is it only at the end of a presidency they can pardon, or can they pardon at any point?
It's just customary historically that they do this at the end. And I don't know. I was reading something that maybe Trump hasn't even done it as much as others generally. But usually pardons come at the end. It's tradition, and we were all waiting for it. And a lot of people had a lot of high hopes for, especially Snowden, I think,
Hmm.
because he had hinted at it numerous times. But don't get your hopes up, I guess. And it's a parable for the police state and surveillance and civil liberties. And hey, it means we got to take matters into our own hands. The government is not going to be out there supporting open source software and supporting your right to remain private. They're just not going to do it. They're just
Hmm.
not going to do it.
And there's a certain piece of open source software that's been upsetting a lot of people recently, especially in the mainstream media, regurgitating articles from 2017, which
Yeah,
we're going to get into. But listen, last time we tried to do this, unfortunately, you had an internet connection problem. Now I
yeah,
got different questions from last time, but I do want to start with the same first question because um,
sure.
a lot of your work is working with people, activists, or people living in authoritarian regimes, or people just living
Hmm.
in developing countries. And the Bitcoin
Hmm.
use case is certainly often different there. With the people you've introduced me to, it's certainly different from maybe what someone like Anthony Scaramucci or Barry Silbert is doing in New York.
Right.
But at the same time, Bitcoin's having a big year. The price has gone crazy. We hit 42,000. We seem to have been ranging between 30 and 40, quite stable around 35. It's very interesting. But even in terms of the work that you do and the kind of use cases people have for Bitcoin, how important is price?
Price is very important because the more people are willing to pay for Bitcoin, the higher the network security because the more revenue miners can make. So we can see this as a validation of the decentralized network security, um, mechanism that Bitcoin has proposed. I would note that the hash rate does not decrease and increase simply with the price. Obviously, during bearish years, we continue to have sort of all-time highs. Miners work on long-term timetables. There's a lot of seasonality to it, but generally speaking, uh, high price in dollar terms for Bitcoin is very good for the network. It's good for all the users, and it's sort of like psychological validation for a lot of people who had been committed to this project, whether from a software or technical point of view, or from like a usage point of view. And it just kind of is this like circular feedback loop where more and more people join and then they get validated and more people join. And it's part of the way that Satoshi designed the system with its scarcity and its sort of decreasing inflation.
And I guess also one bonus side point is that during a bull run, people get some people get very wealthy, and hopefully they get a bit more generous with their Bitcoin and help support projects. Uh, Perhaps even will help support some of the projects with the Human Rights Foundation, because you guys have obviously been doing a lot of work now in supporting open source developers.
Yeah, I do think you saw that, right? In 2017, you saw the Pineapple Fund, right, which gave
Hmm.
away millions of dollars in Bitcoin to different projects. And certainly we've seen some more generosity lately in the last year or so towards Bitcoin development. Uh, as I mentioned before, on different shows. It's interesting because a lot of that's kind of self-interested. Like if you're an exchange or you are a investor in the Bitcoin space or a big name, there is something to be gained for you personally to be supporting the Bitcoin network and the developers working on it. Like you have skin in the game, so it's not purely altruistic. But that's kind of the genius of it, in as much as Bitcoin kind of forces people to donate to it. Like it doesn't, no one works for Bitcoin. There's no Bitcoin company, and yet there are like these meta social pressures for people in the space to donate to the developers, which is becoming more clear now. And again, another cool kind of game theory of Bitcoin.
Well, I think now would be a good opportunity to talk about some of the use cases that people aren't particularly aware of or may not think about too much. The common narrative quite recently, especially with a lot of companies putting money into Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin is a hedge against inflation. And whilst there's a lot of borrowing in the UK and in the US, and some companies are putting money into Bitcoin, they may be trying to hedge against 2, 3, 4% inflation.
Yeah.
Not the most challenging situation to survive. Other countries, maybe people who are in Turkey, are seeing a slightly worse situation. I think inflation there is double digits now. I think it's around 12%. People in Lebanon have had their finances wiped out. But there are other use cases, and I've made a couple of shows this year related to that. But in terms of your work, can we start talking about some of the use cases that you are seeing for Bitcoin, which isn't about just hedging inflation?
Yeah, I mean, to take a big picture view, there are only about 1 billion people, 13% of the world's population, who were fortunate enough to be born into either a scenario where they have a liberal democracy, and B, where they have a reserve currency. What I mean by that is a currency that is held by other governments as a store of value. So obviously the dollar is the dominant one. The euro is the second most dominant one. Together, they comprise more than 80% of reserve holdings. But there are other currencies as well: the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, the British pound, the Swiss franc. So if you take sort of the top 8 or 10 of these reserve currencies and you get rid of the ones that are dictatorships, you really have a very small number of people who are in what I'm calling the dollar bubble. The dollar democracy bubble. And these people benefit from both like strong societies with rule of law, property rights, free speech, as well as a strong currency that doesn't sort of evaporate their savings and allows them to be entrepreneurial, conduct business, et cetera, et cetera. So a very small percentage of the world's population benefits from both of these things. And everybody else, 87% of the world's population, 87%, live under either some sort of dictatorship or authoritarian regime, or a really bad currency that, as you mentioned, maybe is inflating 5-10% a year, maybe even 20 to 30% a year. So for most of the people on Earth, Bitcoin has a lot of potential. And as far as like, how are we seeing that play out? In the early years, you would be right to assess that there wasn't much global use, simply because there wasn't a lot of liquidity. It was hard to find people who even knew about Bitcoin. But in the last couple of years, that's just not the case. I mean, we're seeing an incredible range of people start to understand what Bitcoin could mean for them. I'll give you a couple examples. And again, I do think that, people are like, well, what are the use cases for Bitcoin beyond, a hedge against inflation? Or I guess you could put it another way, what are the use cases for Bitcoin beyond savings technology? And I think that would just be enough. I mean, the very fact that Bitcoin can be a savings technology for people who can't get dollars and live under bad currencies, I mean, immediately you have huge utility for literally billions of people right there. I mean, that's enough for us to basically say that's what Bitcoin does. And that's really amazing that there's this open source savings technology that anybody can access, put their time and energy into, and not have it stolen by their government. Like, that's kind of amazing. Like that alone is remarkable. And you're seeing people take advantage of that everywhere from the largest country in Africa, Nigeria, to countries in, South America, like Argentina and Venezuela, to, of course, even countries in Southeast Asia, which are quite large and populous, ranging from Vietnam to the Philippines. So all over the world, you're seeing people take advantage of the savings kind of component of Bitcoin, this sort of digital gold, right? And that's the one that, of course, look, anybody can appreciate that. And that's why you're seeing these big investment, celebrities kind of move in, institutions, and even some sort of, larger, more conservative entities think about this thing because they're looking for a hedge against inflation. But that alone is like very worthy of, a lot of attention, analysis, research, and discussion. The other part of Bitcoin is probably more interesting for you and me, Peter, and that's digital cash, right? So that's this idea that we have this cypherpunk radical tool that can't be stopped by governments, that is pseudonymous and programmable and can be relatively private and is a sort of parallel economy. I mean, the really amazing thing about Bitcoin is it's not just digital gold, but it's also digital cash. That's the real kicker. Having either would be great, but having them together is really amazing. So we're not just seeing the kind of, as described, people using this as a place to put their time and energy and save it, as opposed to storing their wages in their local currency, which is depreciating very quickly. You're also seeing Bitcoin being used in an activist sense. So for example, there have been pro-democracy movements in countries like Belarus and Nigeria over the last few months, where the government monitors and shuts down the bank accounts and fintech apps of people involved in those protests. And that makes it really difficult to keep going. I mean, you need to basically pay organizers, you need to get gas masks, you need to get water and basic supplies. It costs money to protest, and to do it in an organized way that is actually going to make a difference. Any protest organizer will tell you that. So some of these folks have been able to sustain protests using Bitcoin. They've raised money through Bitcoin. In Nigeria, there was a BTC Pay server instance that was spun up by a loose collective of Nigerians, mainly from the tech and media scenes, that got a lot of attention, raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, was shared by Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter and Square. And that was money that, the government didn't really know where it was going because they were using BTC Pay server. There was no address reuse. The government didn't know where the addresses were. They didn't know what people were doing with it. And B, they weren't able to devalue it or freeze it. When it comes to Belarus, what people have been doing is basically realizing that, hey, if they take large sums of money into their bank account from abroad, the government's going to see that very easily, freeze that, and it's not going to be helpful. So they've been confiscating huge amounts of money that have been coming in the traditional way. So instead, as you and I talked about on one of your shows, there are these grassroots movements where they basically send small amounts peer-to-peer via Bitcoin, and then those people use peer-to-peer marketplaces to sell the Bitcoin into rubles. And the government can't stop this. There's nothing they can do, right? So I think that that's been quite remarkable. The regime all of a sudden can't stop money from coming in to support the pro-democracy movement. And that's made a major, major difference. Those are just two examples of many. You have journalists operating in difficult climates like Hong Kong, for example, the Hong Kong Free Press, who are now accepting Bitcoin donations, which matters a lot in that context because in Hong Kong recently, any actor, institution, or individual who's been donating to the democracy movement is at risk of having their bank account frozen. Many people have had their bank accounts frozen. And it's what the government is trying to do is sort of constrict civil society space. So again, Bitcoin kind of gives us a way out. So you're watching this start to happen in significant ways. I mean, these aren't student projects. These are national movements that are benefiting from this thing. And it's only going to grow from here. And at the end of the day, Peter, what can governments do? I mean, I read this remarkable article yesterday about Pakistan, one of the largest countries in the world, way more than 100 million people living in Pakistan. The Central Bank of Pakistan has banned Bitcoin. There are all kinds of rules and laws saying you can't use it. And yet Bitcoin adoption is sort of exploding in Pakistan. So it's hard to say what governments can do to stop this thing.
So Alex, one of the things I was trying to do before COVID hit and stopped all the travel, I was trying to travel around the world and learn a bit more about how Bitcoin is used in different countries, and get a bit more of an understanding of the environments and such. And it was a real eye-opener for me because we often talk about the benefits of Bitcoin, and as a great example, I mean, Casa, fantastic product, hosted this conversation. I'm a customer, but for me to use Casa, it's quite a complicated procedure, and I have to distribute keys in various different places. when I went out to Salvador and I met people who were earning and using Bitcoin, I can't imagine a scenario where these people who've got very little money. I mean, I went to some of their houses. Their houses are just man-made huts. I can imagine key management is a particular challenge for them. I also, as you know, went to the Venezuela and Colombia border, and I met people there who were sharing mobile phones, and some didn't have data plans. And also in Venezuela, there were like a period of time where there were lots of blackouts. Are we at sometimes, do you think we are ignoring the challenges that people are facing, particularly in developing countries, with regards to securing and Bitcoin and securing their keys and certain issues like that?
It's a tricky question. I would say that an important topic to discuss would be this idea of the bigotry of low expectations, which is actually from it's an idea from the George W. Bush administration. But it was a correct, the concept was correct in as much as basically people were saying, oh, the Arabs and the Chinese, they can't have democracy. They're never going to be democratic. They're always going to need a strong man. And this is essentially what the American government then called the bigotry of low expectations. But in reality, it's just sort of racism. I mean, it's basically saying, oh, like this kind of person can't be civilized, essentially, is what people are saying. And I think we often fall into that with something like Bitcoin, where we're sitting here and it's kind of hard to use. Yeah, I agree completely. I've experimented with a lot of the different components of the Bitcoin stack, from using custodial services to using phone apps to using our different kinds of hardware wallets to running my own full node to using the Electrum personal server and all these different things. And I basically would tell you that for someone like me, it has required basically for me to look at Bitcoin as a hobby, Bitcoin security as a hobby. And I just try to learn more about it and I try to get better at it. But I also have the luxury of not needing to really worry about it. Like for me, it's just sort of a hobby. I make my money today in dollars and I have a bank account, and Bitcoin to me is like a hobby. It's a luxury. And that's almost certainly the case for the lion's share of Bitcoiners in the EU and the United States. I mean, a lot of them are hardcore into Bitcoin and they believe in Bitcoin. But at the end of the day, for most of them, their wealth is not all in Bitcoin. They're not living the Andreas Antonopoulos life. Like they're not making all their money in Bitcoin. It's just not the case. So for them, they're like, oh, this is kind of hard. I can't imagine other people using it. If you flip it on its head and think about somebody who literally can only earn money in Bitcoin, they're going to learn really freaking quickly how to use it. And they're not going to just forget their password. I mean, the most ridiculous article was the one in the New York Times, which focused on this sort of rich Silicon Valley scammer who was so careless, obviously, and so rich that like many years ago, he set up a Bitcoin wallet with, even at the time, was like a decent amount of Bitcoin, rather a decent amount of dollars. Now is this enormous sum. But, he was so privileged and reckless and careless that he forgot the password. And he used this very expensive hard drive device, an iron key, to like store his password, right? Is the person that you're meeting in El Salvador in a hut, first of all, is not going to have an iron key. Second of all, they may have the time and the inclination to spend on the internet, borrowing someone's phone or like literally walking into town to figure out how to use this thing and realize, okay, well, maybe I use a phone app for now, or, maybe I do a paper wallet, or who knows, but they're going to find a way to like keep their Bitcoin safe. I mean, because it's valuable to them. So I think we have to think carefully about this. Like in all of the interviews I've ever done with people, I mean, across literally dozens and dozens of countries, I've never met anyone from an authoritarian regime who has lost their Bitcoin. Like that is not really conceivable. Like, I think that's what happens to privileged, wealthy people in the West who treat Bitcoin as a luxury good. If you're making your income in Bitcoin, and that's where your time and energy is going into, and you're saving in Bitcoin and your family relies on it, which is the case for many people who live behind sanctions, embargoes, who have terrible national currencies that are depreciating very quickly, or simply sort of afraid to use the banking system or can't use it, then you're going to treat Bitcoin very seriously. And, it's highly unlikely that you're going to like screw up and lose your password. Again, that is something that will happen to someone if they don't care about their Bitcoin.
I wasn't necessarily just thinking of people losing their password, but a number of one particular reason we look at key management and is, well, it's a few reasons. Firstly, security, safety, mistakes. There's a number of benefits outside of just forgetting your password, but still, for some people in certain locations, I just think key management will be slightly different. And also, if people are carrying around Bitcoin in their wallets, if it starts to become standard practice, I wonder if that creates perhaps a security risk for that person.
Let me give you a parable from a different part of my work with North Korean activists. So the concept of plausible deniability is actually really important in these scenarios. So there once was a day when the dominant medium to watch outside information in North Korea, illegal foreign information, contraband information, with Hollywood movies, Bollywood movies, South Korean soap operas, was the DVD. And what would happen is that the soldiers would actually come to your town and turn off the electricity, and they'd go into your house and the DVD would be stuck, and they would just extract it using this tool, and then you may go to a prison camp. Okay, so people were still willing to take the risk because they were dying for outside information. I was in an argument with a central banker last night about this, where he was like, well, I told him Bitcoin is very seizure resistant. I think Bitcoin's the most seizure resistant asset in human history. It actually matters a lot. If the secret police come to your house looking for your gold or cash or paintings or even your Bitcoin, and they can't find it, they might give up. They might not, but in many cases, they move on to the next house. It's if they're going to do a mass collection of assets, and you have been careful, and your seed phrase is not written down anywhere in your house, or it's hidden somewhere, you are a lot better off than having cash under your mattress. And for people to not be able to grasp this is really crazy to me. This is the next level of plausible deniability, and it is very important. This isn't even getting to multi-signature. I mean, again, you have the $5 wrench attack, which will always happen, right? But if someone $5 wrenches you, and you literally cannot give them your Bitcoin because it would require the signatures of two other people who are halfway across the world, what are they going to do? I mean, yeah, maybe they're going to torture you to death anyway, but they may just stop because it's futile. So I do think that Bitcoin is much better against the $5 wrench attack or the jackbooted thugs coming to your house than traditional assets, which obviously can only be on your phone, your computer, or under your mattress. I mean, this is a new paradigm here, and I think people should think carefully about that.
So, what challenges do exist then, Alex? What particular challenges are you hearing about? What are people saying to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never actually heard anyone without me prodding them bring up key management as their major issue. I'm sure it is an area, look, given Bitcoin will be around for a long time, obviously I think in 10 years, 20 years, key management is going to be incredible. I mean, we're going to have probably, lots of cheap hardware options. Apple will get involved. They'll make an iNode, and you'll have wearables that will have, jewelry, all kinds of things that will be able to help sign your Bitcoin. There's going to be all kinds of cool stuff that happens in the future. And it's going to make today look like the late 1980s with regard to personal computing. And now we have iPhones and iPads and MacBooks. I mean, it's really going to be similar to that, I believe. But ultimately, I think the biggest challenges for people around the world are still off-ramps and on-ramps. I mean, it's still liquidity. I mean, yes, anyone can receive Bitcoin using a smartphone and an open source, wallet on their phone that they don't have to give ID to use. But today, to be quote unquote useful, yeah, they have to sell it into fiat currency, or they have to be able to sell it, or they have to know they can sell it. Maybe they're saving and they're waiting a couple of years, but sometimes they need to cash out and buy some groceries, or pay for some medical care or whatever. So I think the challenge continues to be security issues, trust issues, and identity / KYC issues around selling the Bitcoin that you've earned or received into the local fiat currency. Now, we're way better than we were in almost any scenario than we were 5 years ago. I mean, light years better. I mean, if you go even just on one website alone, localbitcoins.com, one peer-to-peer marketplace, you can see that in almost every major city on earth above a few million people, there's tons of people willing to buy your Bitcoin. So we have improved a lot, right? But I think on-ramps and off-ramps is still the major challenge. And as far as what I'm concerned about being a privacy advocate would be making these more robust so that you don't have to like give up all of your personal information to buy or sell your Bitcoin. That to me is quite important.
Another thing I wanted to talk about with you is with regards to are there any particular, well, so one of the things we've talked about, like when I had a conversation with Gary Vee the other day, he talked to me about what happens if Brazil and Russia and China all ban Bitcoin, and he was picking particular countries. But quite interestingly, the countries we've seen adopt Bitcoins, I mean, North Korea is an interesting one. I don't really want to use them as too much of an example. But for example, we're aware of a growing interest by the states in Iran of Bitcoin. We know in Venezuela there's an interest. We know now in Russia there's an interest. A lot of it seems to be around mining, but, you know, people who control the power can mine cheaply and, you know, and earn money. But there seems to be an actual growing interest in certain countries where the state's got an interest in Bitcoin. Do you see any downside to this? Any actual risk of the state adopting Bitcoin?
Yeah. So just to qualify the context there with your conversation with Gary, governments banning Bitcoin is not a hypothetical. I mean, as I was mentioning before, Pakistan is one of the largest countries in the world, larger than all the countries you mentioned by population except for China. And Bitcoin is banned in Pakistan. The central bank has banned it, and its usage is exploding, both as far as people being paid in it, miners, etc. So what happens when governments ban Bitcoin? I don't know. It probably gets more popular. In India, the world's second largest country, the Indian government basically tried to make it against the law for Indians to exchange, their local currency for Bitcoin. That was overturned by the Supreme Court. So, it's not gone so well. Look at China. In 2017, the government tried different things to try and restrict its citizenry from exchanging RMB for Bitcoin. Didn't go so well. So this idea that what would happen if the government banned Bitcoin has happened many times and really has been of very little consequence to Bitcoin. Now in the United States, we had this latest scare, right, of which is so far away from banning Bitcoin, but the idea was well, maybe if you want to withdraw from an exchange to to your own wallet that you control, you'd have to give them more information. And that didn't even happen. That didn't happen. We're now in a new administration. That didn't happen. Will it happen? Maybe in the future. Probably not, given that the new SEC chairman is a fan of Bitcoin. So we'll see. But I tend to think that this narrative is overinflated. And now to get to your actual point, is it bad that rogue regimes are using Bitcoin, basically? I think short term, yes, of course, it could be bad for the North Korean government or the Venezuelan government to have another way to conduct their evil business, by getting around SWIFT. So in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, sure, it could have bad implications. But medium to long term, Bitcoin is really bad for dictators because it takes away their ability to have a monopoly of control over the economy, and it prevents them from being able to enforce capital controls, and it prevents them from being able to prop up their zombie currencies and stay in power. I mean, at the end of the day, for a lot of these people, whether you be the dictator, Sisi in Egypt, or whether you be the military regime that's in power in Zimbabwe, I mean, more often than not, the thing that separates them from being in power from them from being overthrown is stuff like the price of bread and the price of wheat. And they need control over the economy to be and exports and imports and currency controls to be able to enforce subsidies. It's the only way they can do it. So over time, Bitcoin is going to prevent them from having total control over their citizenry. And that's really bad news for dictators.
Another area I wanted to talk to you about is a subject that particularly triggers you, but I think some people listening may not be too aware of this. I want to talk about chain analysis firms.
Oh yeah, sure.
Because occasionally there is the odd story about some work they've done that sounds interesting. They found X, Y, and Z happen. That was really useful. But I know you have a particular disdain for chain analysis firms and the threat they pose to privacy and individuals who are living in let's say the less friendly countries. But do you want to talk particularly why you have a disdain for these companies?
Sure. It starts with mass surveillance is bad. Unconstitutional, warrantless surveillance of citizens is bad. It is the way to a police state. And anyone who aids and abets that transformation, of which companies like Chain Analysis are, I would consider bad actors. On a more detailed level, and I've been on numerous debates with different CEOs of different chain analysis companies, chain surveillance companies, as I think we should call them. And they try to basically get out of any personal responsibility of being involved with de-anonymizing people by saying that, the exchange or the company that hires them doesn't give them any PII or personal identifiers, right? That they don't give them names, they just give them addresses and say, hey, what happened with this? But that very claim means they're part and parcel of the de-anonymization process, right? I mean, there is nothing wrong, and in fact is a benefit of Bitcoin, that anybody can watch what's happening on the blockchain. I mean, that's part of it, right? That eventually will deteriorate. I mean, once you start having basically, to put it simply for listeners, once you start having a lot of transaction aggregation, which will happen in the next few years, it'll actually get potentially cheaper for lots of different transactions to be aggregated into one. It'll be basically really, really hard to follow anything on the blockchain. But for now, yeah, it's kind of it's a feature of the system. But you sitting on your couch, or a government entity that's respecting privacy, they don't know what's going on when someone says, hey, I just raised some money in Bitcoin. Like if Peter, you just told me, hey, I just put up a fundraiser, I used a BTC Pay server, and someone donated to me. But it would be impossible for me to know where to begin. I would have no idea what address you used, because it creates a new random address every time. So the only way that chain analysis companies can be helpful is if they are given some sort of head start or some sort of information, right? And that comes from the exchange that has your name and your address and all this other stuff. So the only way that chain analysis or surveillance companies can really be useful in the era of non-reuse of addresses, which is kind of where we're heading, is if they have some sort of partnership with a company that can tell them, hey, this address is linked to this person. It's the only way they can be useful. They need a starting point. They can't just analyze the blockchain without a starting point. The blockchain doesn't tell you anybody's name or address. You have to know that this address belonged to this person, or this address was a thief, or whatever, and then you can follow it. But if no one, if no one can identify the real world implication of an address, then your business is useless. So, to me, they're very much part and parcel of this, again, this, literally permissionless, warrantless surveillance. And they should be ashamed of themselves, and they should just work for some other industry if they care about the future of Bitcoin. The biggest lie is that they care about the future of Bitcoin. No, if they care about the future of Bitcoin, they work to strengthen Bitcoin, not attack it and weaken it.
Okay, I've got one final question for you, Alex.
Sure.
So one thing that will happen as Bitcoin continues to grow is we can see the potential collapsing of currencies, of which sometimes a currency might collapse and people adopt Bitcoin, as we've seen in Lebanon and perhaps some people. And let's not say everyone in Venezuela, because it's certainly not everyone. But do you think there's potential we'll see the opposite, whereby people will start to see at some point the absolute preference for holding Bitcoin, and that could accelerate the collapse of a currency? And in doing so, is this something we should be thinking about? Because the collapse of a currency isn't healthy. at time. You know, there can be negative consequences. Should we really be thinking this through?
I think right now, and even in the next few years or even decades of Bitcoin's life cycle, society will follow essentially Gresham's law, which is this economic theory that the sort of bad money drives out the good from the public marketplace, right? So today, people who really understand Bitcoin don't really want to spend it if they don't have to. They know it'll be worth more in the future, so they're looking to spend fiat. So we're living Gresham's law right now in many ways, and I think we will increasingly live it, where in all of these societies, including America, like people are going to want to spend dollars and they're going to want to save Bitcoin. And that's the same for Bolivars or pesos or Naira or whatever. They're not going to want to spend their Bitcoin if they don't have to. However, eventually, I mean, I do think that, yes, you could see a switch where we then actually go to the opposite, which I think is called Beer's law, where you'd have the opposite scenario, where like no merchant would want to really accept bad currency. They'd really want Bitcoin. They'd offer even like a discount if you gave them Bitcoin, where, the government is going to be taxing in Bitcoin, not in, honestly, their own currency potentially. And where, large transactions, whether it's real estate, university payments, large international, state level interest settlements are done in Bitcoin. I mean, that would be the end game. But I do think we're pretty far away from that. And who knows, gradually, but then suddenly. But I think we're kind of far away from that scenario. So I think for the near future, you're going to have this Gresham's law thing where people really would prefer to spend the sort of worthless or less, valuable fiat currency and really hold on to their Bitcoin. So that's probably what will start to happen in my opinion. And yeah, I mean, if we think of the negative aspects of that, it's going to over time, it's going to really hurt any other competing store of value. Obviously, we know that gold these days are probably numbered as a store of value, ultimately. But also other things that people park their money in to gain interest over time, and and whether that's things like corporate bonds or treasury bills or things like that. I mean, again, we're not there yet, but that could eventually really start to hamper the ability of the state to do certain things, and it's going to really change the world. And some of these things are going to be bad for people. I mean, but there's this inevitability about this. And yeah, I'm here to think through all these things with all of you guys, certainly. But I think that's kind of down the road. What people are probably looking at right now to conclude is like, they're starting to realize how valuable Bitcoin is. They really want to hold on to it. And they're probably going to want to prefer to spend in their local fiat. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, I always appreciate talking to you. I always learn something. I really appreciate the work you've done and getting to know you over the last couple of years now. But thanks again, Alex. Always good to talk to you. And hopefully I'll see you in person at some point.
Yeah, excited to get beers in person soon.
Yeah, man. All right, take care. See you soon.
All right, take care, Peter.